So, good evening, everyone, and welcome. It is a pleasure to have you all here at this launch of a new book by the CEPT University Press. And we have the author, Rahul Mehrotra, joining us from Boston. Very good morning to you. And I would like to request Professor Tridip Surud to introduce him, though, of course, he's very well known in this group and requires no introduction, but I think it is customary, and on this occasion when we are publishing the book, I think it is also fit that we do that. So Professor Tridip Surud.
Rahul, you know that Chirayu is very, very mischievous. He doesn't show that. And by giving me the introduction and saying it's customary that I introduce you, he's put you and me in a bind. We have this very long tradition in the Indian subcontinent, which is to begin by saying that you require, my guest requires no introduction, and then spend half an hour introducing the guest, including revealing the matriculation marks, right? And this is something that we do, we share with all our neighbors. I mean, we do that in Pakistan, we do that in Bangladesh. But I'm going to break with the tradition, and I'm actually not going to introduce you. The audience comprises of your fellow practitioners, people who have admired your work, people who are your friends, and maybe even a few clients. So welcome, Rahul. Wonderful to be able to publish your book and have a conversation around it. I want to remind the audience of one thing, that the purpose of every book launch is only one. It is not to educate you about the book or the topic. For the publisher, there is only one purpose, which is to sell the book. And that's what my job is. So Rahul will try and make it educational, and I will try and make it entertaining so that you are all beguiled into buying the book. Rahul, but let's not waste much time. I know that you have a presentation. What we hope to do is that Rahul will speak about the book. It's a profusely detailed work. This is what it looks like, actually, large and fat and very beautiful. And he will take us through the book, and then we will have time. Rahul and I want to converse very briefly, and then we will open up for more conversations, questions that you might have of Rahul, of the work, of the book. And we hope to do this for the next hour and 15 minutes, hour and 20 minutes more. So Rahul, over to you, and lovely to have you.
Thank you, Tridip. I'm just going to share my screen so we get over all that clumsiness before I start, and then we can begin to speak. You see my screen now? Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, so thank you very much, Chirayu, and thank you, Tridip, and well put. I'm glad you didn't go into the matriculation and all of that. Thank you for your implicitly generous words, so much appreciated. But I also want to say that I am extremely touched, honored, and grateful that CEPT University Press picked up on the book and published it. And of course, one is grateful because one is an alum, and I just feel that many things in the book, many of you, especially my teachers, some of who I see, like Professor Vasavra and others, will recognize many things in the book that come from my experiences at CEPT and the 5 years in Ahmedabad, which were rather crucial. So thank you all. Thank you for organizing this, and thank you for your words. So I am going to, sorry? Yeah, okay, I think we just need to make everyone should mute themselves so we don't have disturbance. Okay, thank you. So let me start. So here the book is called Working in Mumbai. And it actually was an important question for us to ask when we were doing the book about what the format of the book of a book like this should be, because of course it's obvious that after finishing 30 years of practice, one should put a monograph together. I was very averse to that idea, and it's also the reason why it took us 30 years to put something together, on the practice. So the book is really a difficult attempt, in a way, to walk the fine line between doing a kind of celebratory compilation of work, but also being reflective and in a way being self-critical to the extent one can actually be self-critical. It's not an easy task. And so the book begins by declaring that this is not a monograph, and it is really about a reflection. It's about what I would call a kind of, what is described as single and double loop thinking, where you're in the problem, but also can situate yourself outside the problem and reflect about the problem. It's also about really discerning and articulating the patterns that one sees retrospectively. And in honesty, many things one writes about in the book were not necessarily the clear kinds of thoughts that were occurring while one was immersed in those conditions and situations, but they become more clear as patterns really with distance, right? Because you can discern them more clearly and you can see their larger emergent patterns in a sense. So it allowed us also therefore to reflect about failure, to learn from failure. So the book is full of those sorts of reflections. It's all written in the first person. So it's a very personal reading, even in terms of the tone of the book. I think what was very important for me, and I almost in a funny way imagined this as a second volume to the book Architecture in India, which was really a book that looked at architecture in India since 1990, since we began to liberalize our economy. It was also the year we started our practice. And so, of course, in that book, I tried to wear the hat of a critic, so we excluded our work completely. And so this is really like a second volume, almost designed like that in terms of size, font, and even the structure, as a way to pick up on some of those, let's say, situations, conditions, challenges that one identified in that book, and try to sort of pose some of the work of the practice and the research as a response. And so really that book was seminal in creating the foundation for this, because in that book, essentially there were two or three ideas. One was that, there was an obsession, I believed, in India to look at architecture only through the lens of modernism, a first generation post-independence architects who localized modernism in incredibly brilliant ways. And then the extensions and the mutations of modernism was what was being celebrated. And so the question that one asked in that book is, if you remove the lens of modernism, what do you see in the Indian landscape? And therefore, you began to see Akshardham, you began to see faith-based temples, you began to see Laurie Baker and a whole tradition that he sort of triggered off. You began to see many other things. And the other big idea in that book was the notion of models of practice. That is how one engages with the making of the environment and what are the protocols and processes inherent there. And then the notion, therefore, the way those two couple together as ideas is the idea that actually aesthetic modernization arrived on the shores of India before the social modernization process was even triggered off, let alone complete. And so none of these processes are ever complete. They're ongoing processes. But this disjuncture, which occurs in Africa, Latin America, Turkey, it's an idea that Sibel Bozdogan, a Turkish scholar, has really developed, the notion that aesthetic modernity comes before social modernization. And then what are the disjunctures that exist in the built environment? So those are the kinds of ideas that in this lead-in essay, which is a preface to the book, before even the contents arrive, touch upon issues like this. And then the structure of the book is really quite simple. It's 5 parts. It's the architecture of the interior between the rural and urban, constructing cultural significance, which is conservation, mediating the local and global. And the context as generator of practice is the end reflection, trying to intersect research, writing, teaching, and many other activities as parts and modes of practice. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you samples of each of these sections and maybe flag out a couple of ideas that have at least excited me. There are many ideas. These are essays that go from 6 to 12,000 words, so they're substantially long texts, and therefore, the text of these introductory essays is interspersed with a portfolio of selected projects in the book. And so in the architecture of the interior, it really is looking at interior projects. It's looking at when we begin to interface with liberalization, how do we deal with retail? How do we deal with new programmatic contingencies? And how do we work? And, again, alluding to CEPT, Professor Rajay, I remember talking to him once when I just started my practice, and we had just done a first few interiors, and he just reinforced something we were doing intuitively, which gave me a lot of confidence in a way to take on interiors quite seriously, which was, he said, what you've done in these interiors is you have stripped the space down to its rawness and then confronted the architecture. If that becomes the starting point, then you begin to get the architecture of the interior. You don't get interior decoration. And this was a very critical difference that I saw very early, which is how does one actually spatially make and deal with the architecture of the interior? And it's not interior design, which is, I don't mean that's a bad thing, you need that too, but this confronting the architecture and its rawness with those instincts actually takes the way you articulate space within the interior quite differently. This is Swati Snacks in Mumbai. We didn't do the one in Ahmedabad, we've done the 2 in Mumbai, where in this case, in the first one, it was an experiment of how the plan section and elevation actually all folded into the same geometry and the aesthetic. And that's a folded out plan, elevation and sections, elevation and ceiling plan of the space. And then of course, with Bandej, which was very seminal for us in terms of both our practice, but also one was very grateful to Archana and Sanjeev for asking us to do this, mainly because it was my re-engagement with Ahmedabad, which after I graduated for 15 years, I had very little contact, actually no contact. I hadn't even visited it, couldn't recognize the city after 15 years. But Bandej became a very good re-engagement with the city, and I'm very grateful for that. But it was a very challenging project. And these are not images of the Ahmedabad Bandej. These are just the various other shops which deployed the same vocabulary in an extension. But it was also challenging to see how Bandej, that was trying to very sensitively work with local crafts and traditions, but also had to now embrace the space of retail and interface with a society that was now emerging around it with different aspirations. And so how does one make a balance while leaving the integrity of the fabric, the clothes, the colors intact, but yet begin to articulate those spaces in a particular way? And then of course, we also were very interested in recycling spaces and did a number of art spaces that were about recycling and conservation and reusing these spaces and bringing them back into the life of the city. The second section, which looks at between the rural and the urban, is divided into 2 parts. One is called The City in the Village, and the other is Living in the Indian City. And this basically is about looking at the peri-urban conditions, which is something that every city deals with because people are building weekend homes, they colonize farmhouses, and then before you know, the city creeps up to it. And therefore, how does one deal with these perimeters, but also living within the city? How does one think of different types given the emergent sort of requirements and aspirations within the city? And so this is again a very long essay because it begins to try to recognize the emergent urban form of our city. What are the kinds of, what is the agency the architect might or might not have? And it's full of a lot of questions. just questions that we grapple with, sometimes solving them successfully and sometimes not. But it's a very particular kind of condition when you build on the perimeter. How does one create forms of social access? How does one, what I call, soften thresholds? How does one, allow a kind of more easy relationship between the people, or the people who work in these houses, the people who occupy the villages around these houses, and the occupants of the houses themselves, without creating kind of scary, fortified spaces. And so there's a range of situations that we've built these sorts of homes in a way to try to minimize the impact on landscapes, but also in ways that there's a visual porosity, if nothing else, in ways these houses sit on these landscapes. But then also, of course, about engaging with local materials, with crafts, with ways of making these places. This is a house in Kojem in Goa, but also addressing questions like opulence, for example, where this sort of hedonistic activity like swimming or recreating, sitting in a rural landscape, how does one internalize, how does one make some of this more discreet, how does one deal with the scale of the house, so therefore the disjunctures between the locality it sits in and its internal life are slightly more in balance. And of course, in urban areas, the questions become quite different. Homes are getting bigger, plots are becoming apartments. How does one, negotiate within that landscape building and yet framing views, yet creating notions of privacy, yet leaving fragments of the landscape intact, yet bringing green into these buildings. This is a project in Delhi, in the Shanti Niketan colony, where, as in most properties there, with increased FSI, people want to develop these. And this is a case of of three siblings wanting 3 apartments down to the square feet that are equal, but had completely different requirements. So here, 3 apartments interlock, which you can see in the plan, and they're completely different in their requirements, in their plans, but they are all 1,200 square feet, which was required. And they bring in light, they evoke ideas of more traditional dwellings. They have a whole typology of staircases because they're all duplex, so the interconnections are complex, but they also embrace green, bring courtyards, and try to create, living in that kind of FSI hungry society, also pleasurable in a sense. And then, of course, the section on conservation is the most exhaustive essay. It's about 12,000 words, where one has explored, many ideas, which, have to do with the notion of, how does one, as an architect and with our agency, situate ourselves sensitively and empathetically in a very fast transforming environment. And we are not only seen as those who oppose change, but we are the ones who can actually facilitate change in sensitive ways, which is how can we embrace the contemporary, but yet keeping the illusion, the integrity of historic architecture, historic cities and landscapes intact. And as I've sort of spoken about it in the essay, to me, conservation is but a planning tool that every society possesses to modulate the rate of change. And every society can embrace change at different moments. It's in its own evolution in different ways. And so if one begins to place oneself in that understanding and then understand the temporal scale, which might work for different societies, then we are not just opposing change, but you're also beginning to facilitate change in sensitive ways. And of course, it's always a thin line, all of this. And then the other question I think that becomes very important for us to grapple with is, how does one deal with post-colonial situations, especially for our work in Mumbai, where the custodians of an environment are different culturally from the creators of the environment. And so what are the new narratives that one constructs, which is the work we were doing in the fort area in Mumbai, in not only documenting it, but inventing contemporary engines like the art district, like the banking district, as ways that there would be new forms of ownership to engage with the conservation process. And this, of course, involved mapping and measure drawings and, you know, bringing awareness through walking tours, but also then doing conservation plans, in this case, a master plan for the Prince of Wales Museum, where we then went on to do many interventions. So again, how does one bring this contemporary within the historic environment became a big challenge for us. And therefore one has reflected upon that. Till more recently, there are about 4 interventions we've done at the museum, and how then one can create this dialogue without disturbance, but also in the case of the visitor center and other buildings, these we've designed as prefabricated, reversible, and therefore it allows another generation to rebuild an intervention if the ideas of that society change in terms of how it embraces historic environments. And therefore, but they also become forms of social infrastructure in terms of institutional use, cultural landscapes, etc. But also more, let me say, conventional conservation is also what one has explored. What is the notions of authenticity, materiality. And this was a project we did as a master plan, site management plan, for the Taj Mahal, which was a very interesting project because the protocols we set up here are really, I think, in reflection, very important in ways we set up advisory groups. We set up an international board. Bernard Fielden, you see sitting in that with his cap and on site. He became the chair of that group, and it was just an amazing learning experience in trying to do some conservation work, but largely a site management plan. The next section is called Mediating the Local and the Global. And here there are two sections too. One is called Localizing the Global and the other is called Globalizing the Local. And it really is about this idea that we often, in our response to the local or to a locality, we make a caricature of that locality. And vice versa, when we deal with global programs like corporate offices, we make them hyper global. In some way, they could be anywhere in the world. And so the notion of how does one localize the global, that how does one make global programs, whether it's corporate money or software companies, more committed to the locality through architecture, but how does one globalize the local without making it a caricature so it resonates more globally in terms of even the lessons that it brings from that locality. I think that has been an ambition, and one has tried to articulate that position in these essays. And so these are, again, long essays, each one of them about 5,000-6,000 words. So they dig into the subject, to the extent one could. And I mean, I'll just give you 2 examples before I move to the last section. One is this project that we did for LMW, which is Lakshmi Machine Works. This was a project we completed in '96. We were appointed to do this in 1994. Our practice was only 4 years old. We had just started practice, but the clients were very conservative and they asked us not to publish it. And so many people don't even know about the project. We did this one big project of 100,000 square feet and went back to doing interiors and small houses. And I'm glad for that, that we didn't get another big project, because it allowed us to go back and, go back to a scale that I think we were better equipped for. Anyway, so in this project, it was interesting. This was occurring at the moment India was trying to globalize and liberalize, and the clients were very clear. They wanted a glass tower of 7 floors. But in many very engaged conversations with them, and like I said, we were very young, just starting the practice, but I think we were successful, that the paradigm shifted and it became a building around 3 courtyards, only 2 stories high, with a 20,000 square foot Mangalore tile roof that covered it all at one level. So it allowed us to create a datum through the roof, but within it to mold the spaces to house 7 companies in a very kind of complex set of relationships. And the other thing that happened here was they had a big budget for art, and we felt that we should have art as integrated with the building. So with Rajiv Sethi, who brought together about 7 artists, including Manjeet Bawa, Yogesh Raval, and many other traditional artists, they developed the elements for the building. Like Manjeet Bawa here, you see he's working with us on site. He did all the railings for the building, where he took the figures that he painted and translated them into embossed copper on cables, and they became a railing. So as you walk through the bridges and things, there's this kind of narrative and story that he tells. And of course, I don't want to get into the project. There were many other such lessons. And then Yogesh Rawal did something very beautiful with Rajiv Sethi, is go to the LMW machine tool plant and pick up all the scrap metal and develop a whole vocabulary of jalis for the building, because the whole building was designed for natural ventilation. And so I think these became ways very early on when, everyone was running to bring in Alico bond and to bring in curtain glazing. We had the opportunity to kind of do something like this, which I think extended many of the local traditions, but also created a more humane environment more generally for those people to work in. And of course, so there's a series of projects like this where this has been explored in different ways, including a campus for Hewlett Packard in Bangalore. But the other project I can't avoid touching upon is CEPT, which for us was perhaps the most difficult and complex project, but also a very satisfying one, because it allowed one to, well, it was again an honor to be doing this, but a difficult negotiation. But interesting in how one could then be confronted with the notion of intervening in what might one call a modern heritage environment. And I remember in the beginning, there was so much discussion about whether there should be exposed brick and concrete, or how could one otherwise translate it. And then we finally valued the idea that scale was more important. And so therefore took on the challenge of going 3 floors below ground to meet the requirements of the library, rather than interrupt the historic environment, and then create these sort of spaces that create the variety. And while I have the CEPT audience, and while I have Tridip here, the space that you see here with students and the jury, which is on the ground floor, it's interesting. It's being used a lot for exhibitions. I think CEPT needs to start its own exhibition center, because this building has been overtaken by exhibitions, which is not meant to, which is a good transition, because I think it brings awareness to exhibitions. But just to put on the table the original intent of that space was just ambiguity, as you see in that image, which was really only for juries and reviews. But most importantly, we had imagined that it would be a space that different faculty members would be given to curate from the library small exhibitions on books. So someone, for example, could pick out all the books on Louis Kahn and then do a talk quite informally there. And so it would be a space where the wealth of the library, there could be an exhibition on theses that have documented Jaisalmer, or whatever thematics you want. But it would be wonderful that if in the long run that space went back to being part of the library and the archives, because the archives was something that was also being discussed, and both these functions on the campus need a space where they can make a public interface. I know the archive already has a space, but it would be nice if this space finally went back to some use like that. But anyway, I think the library for us was very interesting for many reasons, as I've sort of explained. And then the last section is called Globalizing the Local, where here, this is a campus for kids who live in slums, an NGO who takes them for education. Here we used all the materials from the slums, but reconfigured them. So there was familiarity, but yet there was a resonance globally. It wasn't a caricature. Anyway, again, the client brief here said, let's make an Indian village, because these kids but these kids have nothing to do with the village. Their parents migrated 2 generations ago to Mumbai and living in horrible conditions. And therefore, it was more about creating lightness, light spaces that they could really enjoy. And these ideas then morphed into trying to develop prototypes for community toilets, trying to do the low-cost housing project we did for the Hathigaon in Jaipur, which became more a landscape project, where architecture wasn't privileged as much as landscape was, which was also a learning. But in this project, I think the more important thing was us mapping the complexity of it. And this is a mapping in the book, which shows the different actors, including ourselves, the different bureaucrats, the government agencies, the politicians, and who at what moment makes what decisions and who aligns with whom, the kinds of sample letters we were writing to make a case, etc. The book ends with a reflection, a meta-reflection, which is called Context as Generator of Practice. And it is really a reflection of 30 years of working. It looks at my involvement with the Urban Design Research Institute, the research in Mumbai. It looks at the many exhibitions we have done and what they've meant and how they've connected to our work, the process of making, how we rely on model making, what that means for the practice, the many books and how they have actually sat within the practice, and it's a reflection. The book then has a separate book at the end, which is about, Tridip, I'll take 5-7 more minutes, that's it, yeah. It has a separate book almost at the end, which is about 80 pages, it's 40 double spreads, and it's a chronology of 200 projects from 1990 to 2020. But what it does is it organizes it visually to create intersections between projects, between other involvements in the city, committees, affiliations, publications, exhibitions, and then of course affiliations and advocacy, etc. So those get coded differently so that one actually begins to see, and this was again for us a very important process to reflect on how these intersections occurred. And it was after finishing the chronology that one wrote the previous essay that I just showed you. And so I'm just showing you samples. So this is the beginning of the practice. The first projects were Jahangir Art Gallery and 200 square foot shop for bandage in Mumbai, which was the starting of us and our engagement. But then you begin to see the fort area and that engagement, at what moment it comes, when we begin to start doing conservation work, cities within the legislation in Mumbai. So you begin to see, I think, for me, very interestingly, these intersections of doing things that were seemingly very disparate, simultaneously valid, but very nourishing in a way, I believe, in retrospect for the projects. And later there are years where it's only projects. The year we were doing CEPT and we were doing competitions, and this is the Lalbhai Gallery. We didn't do any books, so there's very little other activities. And there were other times where there were many more books and there were very small projects. And so this sort of mapping, it was very productive in terms of how we learned from it. And then there's a celebration of the studio at the end, when this infographic, you have the position, the length of time that everyone who's gone through the studio is sort of mapped here. And so this again is a few pages of celebrating the studio, the work culture, and all of that. So about 5 lessons I want to leave you with very quickly. One is, I think, in reflection, these are some of the key things that I would bring out maybe for our discussion or otherwise, is that I think the idea of what is the architecture of practice, what is that armature that we build within which practice is situated, is more important than discussing the practice of architecture. The second is that we have to be careful that while binaries allow us to organize the world around us, you have to be careful you don't inhabit one aspect of the binary. Our job as designers is synthesis, how we make, we dissolve these binaries. And I think these are all themes that are reflected in the essay, so I'm just sort of highlighting them. The third one, which is very exciting for me, is a critique on the laziness with how we as architects look at what the client is, right? A client is a very complex entity, which is a patron, an operational client, a user client. In a weekend house, the client collapses into one entity and you deal with differences within a couple, but more than that, it's all usually on the same page. That's why we love doing weekend homes, and we do our best work, and most of the stuff magazines publish are weekend and single family homes. But when you have a differentiated set of clients within the entity of the client, it becomes very complex. So for us, so let's say take CEPT, the Ahmedabad Education Society, you could argue, is patrons. Operational clients are everyone in charge of the campus, the building committee, etc. And the users are the faculty and students. And how do you bring them on the same table? Or in Hathigaon, it was the chief minister, the mahouts and the elephants, and then the public works department or the Amber development department or the forest department, which kept changing. And actually, these 3 entities have very little communication with each other. They're silos in themselves. And so therefore, the architect's role becomes a bridge practitioner, because you're making bridges between them. And then it's this notion of the sphere of concern and influence, that our sphere of concerns are expanding while our spheres of influence are diminishing. And how does one create those intersections and recalibrate them? And then most importantly is that I've been often asked this question, that how do you decide on what research you want to do? And I always say it's actually the research is independent of the practice. The practice follows the research. The research doesn't follow the practice, because if you have research following practice, then it's opportunistic. It's part of the project. But the bigger research questions have to be independent, and they inform the practice. And if you can't have a preconception about it, I think you have to be very open in how that might influence your thinking and your practice. And for me, the books and the research really finally become instruments of advocacy, implicitly or explicitly. Implicitly in that other people run with it, and explicitly in that some of those causes become your own causes. And so this book really captures all this thinking, and I'm going to take the liberty of just sort of also announcing that the Working in Mumbai, which CEPT has just sort of published, captures these. And the new book, which will be out in a month or so, is called The Kinetic City and Other Essays. And this is a compilation just on the aspect of research and writing and practice, which is also embedded in this book, but one has extracted that to elaborate it a little more. And so with that, I just want to thank Tridip and Chirayu again. I hope you all enjoy reading the book, and I would love to hear from you all once you read the book on what your thoughts are. So thanks again. Thank you very much, not only for publishing the book, but also for this opportunity to share it with my friends and teachers and others.
Thank you, Rahul. Thank you very much. I should tell you that Atma and CEPT have just signed an understanding by which the great building would be converted into, or would be also used as, a cultural center. And it will create a nice relationship between the library as an exhibition space and Atma as an exhibition space. So let's see what we do with that. I have three broad concerns that I wanted to explore, and then we could open up to people in the audience, and they could join the conversation. I wanted to pick up on what you said in your last conversation with Naresh Fernandez, which came out in the media, where you make a comment and you attribute it to somebody else, but this is something which is very profound, that architecture has to be grounded, that there is no way by which you could create architecture which is not grounded. It has to be entrenched. And that entrenchment, that groundedness, creates a certain kind of form of practice, certain kind of reflection. What I wanted to ask you was partly biographical and partly a reflection on practice, which is that if architecture is entrenched in the way that you speak of it, how is that the architect is a peripatetic creature? How does one attain that mobility as a professional while the work remains affixed to a specific ground?
Well, yeah, no, thanks. That's a good and a complicated question. In many ways, and I think, again, this is why I bring up the notion of what is the architecture, the armature of practice in how you do this, because your question implicitly has in it the assumption that the architect is the single operator, correct? So therefore, I think much of that groundedness comes in ways one can set up those collaborations and therefore clarify what different contributions might be. So there might be situations where me as a practitioner is someone who is actually metaphorically and literally much more grounded in that place. I would imagine, like when I do things in Mumbai, or when I'm living there, I was living there more continuously than I do there now. It was quite different. But in another location, one of the things that has been part of our practice, like right, I think from day one, literally, is we've always collaborated locally, however big or small the project was. So in Mumbai, we didn't need to do that because we were based there. But otherwise, we always collaborated locally, and we continue to do that in extensive ways. In fact, I don't know if she's on the discussion, but I had a very long discussion with Meghal about this, where she pointed it out to me, Meghal Arya, who was a professor there, because she is just beginning to do something on a project which involves these collaborations. He said, but you've been doing this for, and it made me conscious of the fact that we actually have been. So those become modes of doing this. So for example, let me even take the Taj Mahal project. We started a separate entity for that called the Taj Mahal Conservation Collaborative. Besides the idea that I'd grown up with the stories that, anyone who had anything to do with the Taj Mahal was blinded and their fingers chopped off. One lived with that fear. So I didn't want to go into that project, even if it was just site management alone. But we created a whole entity which dissolved after 10 years once the project was done. And we've done that on a number of projects where you recognize that in today's time, this mobility movement is intrinsically part of our lives, and the project shouldn't suffer as a result of that. And therefore, then how does one create this structure of engagement, of collaboration, to be able to get the pulse of a place and to be able to create those feedback loops with the locality and what you might understand from it. And I think that's important, and that's the best one can do. I think, this is also a question of scale. I'm often, teased, let me say, with my colleagues in Boston, saying that, you're a, jet-setting flying architect. And I look at them and I realize I'm the only one who's doing all the work in one place, which is India. They're building in China, they're building in New York, they're building here, there, and the other. It's just that my work is divided very clearly in terms of my research, teaching, and my practice. So our work is all India. It's something I believe is an area I understand. Within India, there are places one understands better and one doesn't. And so therefore one has to modulate it to the extent one could.
But Rahul, would you want to also, what you just said, but if you would want to relate it to the section in the book, which is really looking at language of architecture, of influences, what you call, what is it of the local that you take and universalize in some ways, and what of the world outside that you bring in, and does this occupying a certain kind of a no space as an architect help in that process?
Oh, it absolutely does, because it allows you to modulate these understanding any permutation and combination. Actually, if you're overly local, then your alliances become limited, because your alliances become highly localized and therefore can also be politicized, which often happens. So in fact, that's why I use the word how one calibrates that, what you described as mobility and restlessness in a way, with the ability to root, because while it allows you freedom, the freedom can be dangerous, and therefore one has to keep recalibrating that permutation. And I think that freedom you have to be conscious about, which is what one has tried to do, as you know, in the book, which is try to articulate some of these things, because I think we need to have much more of a discussion about this, because otherwise the local and the global, the contemporary and the tradition, these again are totally useless binaries. If they can't confront each other in dialogue in whatever permutation might be relevant for that locality.
Second, I think the large section that, it's not really, I think it deserves a separate discussion by itself. Is this entire concern that you foreground, and which also came through in the presentation that you made, about the aspiration of the architect and the reach of architecture, right? The expectation that the profession has of itself, that the self-image that the profession has of itself, and an increasing realization at some point that maybe the ambit is not so large, maybe you are circumscribed by forces which are larger, sometimes more powerful, and at all times more cunning than you are. right? How does one really negotiate that? And I think this is really a question of all professions in India. Some professions have created a reach which is much larger than themselves. Law, for example, has been able to do that. And architecture has really never managed to do that. I mean, you've never had 6 or 8 cabinet ministers who are architects, right? I mean, law very, very routinely manages to extend itself into realms which are not its expertise, creates, creates a mode of engaging with society, with polity, with economy very differently. And that's something that a profession would want to do, a self-confident professional would want to do. But where do you see this going?
Yeah, no, that's again an excellent question. You know, one of the things, I'll say 2 things to foreground this, and then I'll give you my perspective on it. One is that architecture is very material. Its tangibility is so high that, you know, as we were told at CEPT, doctors can bury their mistakes, architects can't. It's the material impact you make is huge. So, you know, therefore everyone and his uncle and auntie have an opinion about it. As an object, right? So I think we already are on a back foot there, correct? The second is the condition in which architecture gets built. You know, I mean, when you go to a doctor, you're down in the dumps, you're willing to listen to almost everything the doctor advises you. When you go to an architect, you have a lot of money in your pocket and you want to tell the architect what you want and what the architect. So, you know, we get situated, we have to understand we are always on the back foot as a result of many of these things. Now, the most serious aspect of my answer is the 4 or 5 issues that I highlighted at the end. We have to be open to other modes of practice, which I think our pedagogy doesn't prepare us well enough to do. We have to extend that to, I use this metaphor because I really believe in it, is that we have to be bridges in society, right? So let me explain that. I think, as you said about law, I think architects we haven't situated in ourselves in the space of society. Some people have, and this has happened more and more in the last 20 years, but we've been an isolated professional. We have to see ourselves as part of civil society. So what does one then mean by civil society? I think it's that aspect, that part of society that has the ability to empathize, relate to, and work with the grassroots, but it also has the ability and the wherewithal to negotiate with more powerful forces, right? So trade unions, for example, are part of civil society. Many foundations and NGOs and that whole sector, that's part of civil society. So we have to create those kinds of formulations if we have to find a space in society. Within the conservation movement, that begins to happen by default because you've got to engage people and users, and you've got to negotiate with politicians. Very few people are doing it at the scale of the city, but you could also do it at the scale of architecture. I mean, if one is doing a building in a campus, in an institution, we take the brief. We take the brief often just from the operational client and we translate it. We don't try creating those negotiations because we feel it'll be a Pandora's box. Yep. But if we don't do that and we don't make the bridges, which means we don't try to bring the aspirations of the most complex form of the client on the same table, I think we are shooting ourselves in the foot. And till we do that, we won't have a voice in society, I believe. And I think one formulation could be that we see ourselves very much as part of civil society, which also then extends our gamut. It extends our gamut through maybe even internal cross subsidies within our projects, where we might we might rob the rich to, you know, help the poor in a sense, and create those cross subsidies. It'll change our mindsets. Right now, our economics of practice are too black and white, and the way we situate ourselves in one or the other part of all these binaries for not only our own comfort level, but because sometimes we get caught in a moralistic, value-ridden trap that no, we must only work for the poor. You know, you can't do that. You have to do both simultaneously if we have to be effective to answer your question in society. Otherwise, we are not bridges within society. We become affiliated with one group or the other, and we become part of the binary, not the ones who dissolve the binary.
Thank you, Rahul. I think, you know, in political theory, which is what I understand much better, there is a space called the intermediary structures, which really are required to negotiate between structures of power and people. And I think professions and the kind of bodies that you spoke of play a very, very important role. And I think, but I think the profession and therefore institutions who teach these professions have to really think about very, very seriously about that part of our role. And this is the last question from me, and then I will let others speak. This is part autobiographical, as you say, and I've always in my life grappled with autobiographies. That's what I do, as I say, that's my core competence, is to read autobiographies. I find it very, very interesting. If I were to ask myself, what would be an autobiography of an architect look like? Is this the form that's available to you? Because the kind of stories that you can tell about the self, right, necessarily and primarily involve an externalization that happens in form of that building, in form of that intervention, in form of a relationship to a set of clients or users. Does it allow for a kind of interiority that the autobiographical voice demands of us? Now, you could say that demand is an unjust demand, or not a demand that all writers of the self are required to have. But this really makes a very, very different form of the autobiography.
It does. And, so this was, thank you, Tridip, for asking that question, because for me, it's been a struggle, since I did architecture in India since 1990, which was in 2010, it's been a 10-year struggle to say, or to think about, because, when I did that book, my well-wishers, let's say, or people who are friends said, my God, it's ridiculous. You left the work out. You all should have had some projects, this, that, and the other. So that left me with this struggling question of what should that form be? And I found, so there, how are these things done? You can either get a critic to write it, which is a very legitimate form, because there's some practices that don't want to self-reflect. But for any practice, even for our own, I know if a critic picks it up, and I know one who might do it, it might be a completely different reading, correct? And so therefore, this was a big struggle. And I just felt that because one had been teaching, which for me was a blessing, because I think I learned more from teaching, because it helps you to articulate ideas more sharply, which you have to communicate it to another generation. But it made me feel very responsible that if I did, I think, have the skills to be able to do that, just because I was blessed with having had the experience of writing and teaching, that I should take it upon myself to bring my voice to it. Now, two things come with that. One is a complete commitment, because every word there is mine. It's not someone else blowing my trumpet or beating the drums, or there's no Puss in Boots in a way, for the work. So every word is a commitment. And that's why finally I decided, and this might have to do with form again, Tridip, correct me if I'm going off track, but I also decided that I won't have a foreword or a preface or anything else, because that already begins to bring a reading on.
I think an autobiography that needs somebody to introduce either the author or the book loses its charm.
Exactly.
And a purpose.
Exactly. So, and that's why in the next book, which is The Kinetic City and Other Essays, we have a very good foreword and we have an excellent afterword, because I thought that is a more objective set of readings, because those were just analysis of the city. And it's not an autobiography in that sense. But here, I think the idea of commitment, of bringing every word to bear, and saying that one is committed to what is saying, right or wrong, you can challenge it, was, I think, it was critical for self-reflection. Otherwise, it would just become a monographic celebration, which is unfortunately what many monographs become. And they're valuable, I don't mean that at all, but it just didn't seem the right form for me.
There is a difference between a monograph and a monologue. right? And
This might be a
so that,
monologue. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, but
right. So
no, but Tridip, I just want to add one more thing, which might
yeah,
be just of interest. And the other reason for doing this was that they are a lot of disparate activities that one has been engaged with,
yeah,
and I just felt that I just for myself I needed to try to weave them together because it was something that had been, let me say something I'd been struggling with, is
mm,
that do these things actually relate or are these different activities? I mean, just anecdotally, I'll just say, for example, in Mumbai, I mean, even some of my closest friends, when they saw the book, were surprised that we had done buildings. They just thought I wrote about Bombay and did walking tours and did some conservation work here and there, right? And conversely, friends in Coimbatore and Chennai and all had no idea that one was also writing, because there we were building buildings. So one was living this dual life, and an extension of that was we never got invited for many competitions, and this is because when juries were making competition lists, they said, oh, he just writes, he doesn't practice, and historians never took us seriously because we were practitioners. They do modern buildings. So one actually inhabited many lives, and this goes back to your earlier question, which had to do with locality and place. Actually, this was, I now in retrospectively, while one was practicing over 20 years, it used to bother me a lot to feel very excluded from many forums where I felt I legitimately actually belonged. But actually, in retrospect, it was actually liberation. It was freedom, because it allowed one to move through these worlds on one's own terms, rather than the terms that might be stipulated. And so I think those are the kinds of reflections that you'll find in the book, as you have seen by reading it, which are in some ways related. So in a sense, your first question, I'm perhaps answering better now at the end.
thank you, Rahul. I am going to take questions from the chat box, and I'm not going to read out the names, but there is this question about coming to terms with the changing technology of which allows you to visualize differently, which allows you to imagine differently, and you've seen the gamut of change. You've lived through it, you've practiced it. So there's this question: how do you really make that transition, or have you made the transition, or do you do things in a particular way, and then other colleagues take on other tasks which they are more familiar with or competent for?
Thanks. So, I'm actually going to expand that question because it's too black and white for me. This is a question of transition. And so the two transitions, or the meta transition that my generation has made, is when we started practice in 1990, when we were educated in the 80s. India was even ideologically and politically very much a socialist kind of democracy, correct? With certain values, protocols, the way opulence was externalized or not, the way the elite behaved in terms of their patron instincts. I mean, there was a whole different world, right? In 92, we became a liberal economy, correct? But as my colleague Yves Blau has pointed out, that these transitions don't happen with a switch being hit. These transitions take decades. So you transition out of something for 2 or 3 decades, and you transition simultaneously into something for 2 or 3 decades. And what you might land up in the end is not even a clear picture. So India is not going to be a clearly capitalist society at the end of 2 decades, right? It'll be some crazy muddle, which we can already begin to see. So in the same way, I think technologies and all are just subsets of all of that in a way. And so more pointedly to your question, of course, one does this in a hybrid mode. I'm not the most proficient on AutoCAD, but I have colleagues who can do it. I can read the stuff. We have been engaging with virtual meetings 12 years before the pandemic started and set up the protocols for that. So there are different technologies. Drawing technology is one. One yet uses the pencil, if that was the pointed question, marks up drawings and all of that. And one uses advantageously and very much enjoys what one's colleagues do in terms of how they use these new technologies for allow us to engage with, see our projects and study and inform them in much more nuanced ways.
There is another question, which is about the form of the book itself, and not just the form of the book, but it's also, how that form might have influenced your reflection. There is a certain chronology to it, and there is therefore a linearity to it. The question really is that if you had consciously broken that linearity, which I think it has been broken, but if you had really gone completely non-linear, would you have would you have looked at the practice differently? Or is a chronology and a linearity actually allows one to think both biographically, but also in terms of knowledge accumulation?
Excellent. And I just want to acknowledge this question. It's a very good one, Shantesh, I think.
Yeah.
But it's an excellent question. And just for those of you who might pick up the book, the essays are completely non-linear, and therefore they become explorations. And the chronology is an attempt to bring some order to that madness that you see in the essays. So the essays jump around through issues in a completely non-linear way, but tease out what within that rubric, whether it's the local and the global or the urban and the rural one, within that rubric, one tries to frame an understanding, but it's completely non-linear. Most of the essays anyway. So the chronology was a way to actually, in a linear fashion, situate different streams of activities and therefore see their intersectionality. And that couldn't have been done if it was non-linear. And for me, in the chronology, it was more important to see if there were patterns where other activities influenced what we were doing as projects, or vice versa, or was there a time lag between doing some kind of advocacy and conservation and then doing something else quite different later on? I mean, it's interesting to see, the cover of the book on Victoria Terminus, which is neo-Gothic, and on the same page to see images of projects which have a completely different aesthetic. And so therefore, it was my way of grappling with the simultaneous validity of this, that one can be engaging in both those things. I remember when we had done the book on Victoria Terminal, on the High Court building, somebody came to the office and they said they loved the book on the High Court and they want to do a farmhouse and they want to do a neo-Gothic farmhouse, and they thought I was a neo-Gothic expert. And of course, we never did the project. But so I think those disjunctures, understanding when those intersections happen, what it means, and how within each of those spaces you can create an integrity of protocols and cultural norms and integrity, which allow you to engage with those separate activities, whether it's teaching, whether it's writing, or whether it's practice. In themselves, they have to have an integrity, but they can simultaneously exist. And so for me, the chronology is a message towards that end.
Yeah. Let me ask a question that I want to ask. How does Rahul as a teacher, as a dean, Dean Mehrotra, as you would be called, or Dean Rahul, as you would be called back in
Mehrotra, don't make me a
Mehrotra.
Punjabi.
Sorry. Right. How does the academic really look at what happens in a studio being related to the practice that she or he does?
Well, at the most fundamental level, you have to walk your talk. And I think students are the first who recognize if there is a disjuncture between the values you bring to your practice and what you do and how you implement them and what you're teaching. Students are very quick to pick that up. And so it actually keeps, for me at least, every teacher must have different experiences. I went into teaching very late in my career, which I regret. But it just keeps you very honest, and it keeps you honest to the extent that it pushes in both directions, which means as your position on something gets firmer, it pushes you in your practice to also bring that rigor, and vice versa. So it's, I think, a process of oscillation where each informs the other. It has to, otherwise I think it doesn't nourish us intellectually. And so for me, that's why I say I learn a lot from teaching, and maybe going into teaching late was maybe a blessing, I don't know. but it forces you to articulate your positions, and in the process of articulating those positions in order to communicate them, I think you clarify a lot. I think for me, teaching is about clarifying not only for myself, but also for the student, and trying to root it. And I suppose as a practitioner, the value that one adds, which is something I must say I learned that was fundamental. I mean, the impact of CEPT on all of this is another conversation. But I would say that one of the things that I can't tell you now in retrospect that I really reflect about that was that most of our teachers were really good practitioners at CEPT. I mean, every studio I can think of, they were really good practitioners at every scale. I mean, just because this is a CEPT crowd, more or less, I would just say you start your first design studio with Leo Pereira doing rural housing. You move with Mr. Egbote, who teaches you urban housing. You move into your fourth semester with Vasavra, Professor Vasavra, where you're making an intervention in a Swami Narayan historic heritage complex and he encourages you to do a contemporary intervention. I mean, and he's a practitioner, so he can actually speak on those terms in terms of the challenges. So, Gemini Mehta, actually we did working drawings with Gemini Mehta, which was, an amazing experience because it brought this interface of design. Professor Rajay, they were all practitioners. And so they were as grounded as you could get, and their values, you could as a student see that they actually had made their talk walk. And that was very inspiring. And I think that's one of the biggest lessons I took away from my education at CEPT, which I have become much more aware of later on when one has become a teacher and a practitioner oneself.
Thank you, Rahul. I don't see many. Well, there is a question which says, how do you approach the integration of light in your design? Is it a form giver or a material? And what does Indian light mean to you?
Oh, geez. We might have to get into poetry here now, but
no, don't do that. Dangerous.
No. This is my point is I mean that in jest. I think this is it's a very important and a good question, and a complex one to answer. And I don't even know if I can answer it in blanket ways. But to me, Indian light, it is very harsh, but it's also very beautiful. And what is incredible about Indian light is its incredible modulations through the day and through the seasons. And so it becomes a real challenge on how you draw it in, how you soften it, and how you, make its interface with materiality. Now, one can talk to that question, whoever asked that question, in greater detail on each project, but it's hard to do any justification to it in a blanket way. That's why I said the only way one could do that is kind of poetic formulations, which this might not be the right forum for.
And then there is the minor question of heat that comes along with light, but we are not going there.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question, if there is, and if there isn't, we shouldn't force ourselves to ask it. But there isn't, Rahul. So let's try and conclude here, just by thanking you very, very much. It was, as a publisher, I must say, you gave me no trouble. And that's what a publisher looks towards. And this is for all potential authors. Give me trouble-free books to do. I will be very happy to do that. That's the easiest thing that one does. But I thank you very much. I think in the short life of the CEPT University Press, this is a very important milestone, and we are very happy that we've collaborated on the project. It's befitting that we should do so. It's also that the beautiful library building is on the cover of the book. Great pleasure, Rahul. I still think that it would have, it would have been much better if we were together in person. because there's an afterlife to a conversation. And I am always more interested in the afterlife of the conversation, which is not going to happen here. But we will make up, and I know Archana and Sanjeev are both in the audience. There would be an afterlife to this and many other conversations. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pradeep, if I may add, I'm also one for customary things. So I think, when you visit Ahmedabad, we will do the customary things of, posing with the book and all that. So those customary things of a book launch also we should do, I guess.
And you have to sign copies, Rahul. They are very important, because when they eventually go on eBay, there is a more price to be had if it's a first edition signed by you. Right? As all books end up on eBay finally.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. I also wanted to, I just noticed that Rajesh Vora was here, who has been the photographer of the book, and I just want to acknowledge his contribution. And I hope, he studied at NID, and I hope when we do this actual physical book launch, we can invite him also. It will be a nice crossover with NID too. But again, thank you to you both. Thank you to the CEPT University Press, and thank you to everyone who's attended. I can recognize many names, friends and teachers, and so thanks. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, and have a good evening, everybody. Good day.